How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so in his book, The Conquest of Happiness, published in 1930, Bertrand Russell argues that among the greatest of obstacles to happiness are not so much external conditions, but the contraction of our experience of the world. And what he mostly has in mind here are forms of self-absorption, which is our tendency to direct attention obsessively towards ourselves, to our own feelings and imaginations. In other words, for Russell, it's self-preoccupation or a kind of inwardness that's among the greatest sources of unhappiness. If we want to achieve happiness, we have to learn how to turn our attention outwards, away from ourselves and towards the world. That's the key for Russell. Okay, but let me try to explain in a bit more detail what it is that Russell argues. So he begins by saying that often if you look at unhappy people, you'll notice that in one way or another, they're preoccupied with themselves. They're like a room with the windows shut, he says, locked up in themselves. Now, this doesn't mean that all introspection is bad. Of course not. Honest self-reflection from time to time is absolutely crucial. But when the self becomes the dominant or exclusive object of attention, when introspection becomes obsessive, that's when it becomes corrosive, and that's when happiness becomes impossible. So another way to put this is that for Russell, unhappiness is deeply linked to a narrowing of experience. It's when we shrink our world to the narrow theater of our mind. It's when we spend our time thinking about our own desires and fears and our own wounds rather than opening ourselves up to others and to a real and whole other world out there, outside of us. Actually, Russell uses himself as an example here. He says that when he was an adolescent, he was on the verge of suicide, but that what kept him alive was his yearning to understand more mathematics. So what saved him was that, at least when it came to math, what saved him was that he was able to direct his view outward, away from himself, to something much more interesting and productive than toxic self-introspection. Actually, you know who I'm reminded of here? I'm reminded of the infamous Don Quixote. You know, that noble knight errant that Cervantes gives us. Now, you might be thinking, how is he at all relevant here? Well, what most people forget is that Don Quixote's real name was actually Alonso, and that for most of his life, he was a nobody. He was a non-entity. He was poor and single, and he was confined to the company of his housekeeper. And that most importantly, he spent all of his time at home, in his head, obsessively reading books. But then one day, early dawn, things changed. Suddenly, Alonso, in his early 50s now, decides to, quote, turn knight-errant and travel through the world with horse and armor in search of adventures. He opens himself up to the rough and mysterious landscape of La Mancha. And as of that moment, Alonso is gone and a new vital man, Don Quixote, is born. He's born because he's freed himself of the narrow and self-absorbed confines with which he'd spent his life. Well, I don't think this is too far from what Russell is getting at. We grow stale and we grow unhappy when we can't bother to get up from the couch and direct our attention away from ourselves and engage with the wider world out there. Actually, Russell's not the only philosopher to talk about this connection between unhappiness and self-absorption. The contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul also echoes a similar diagnosis, but he frames it in the context of what he sees as today's increasingly narcissistic society. And he especially talks about this in a book that's called The Agony of Eros. What he argues is that what the narcissist today suffers from is a deficit of relation. That's to say, they don't leave themselves. They only encounter their own reflection. They live in a closed loop, never in contact with or in relationship with others. And this lack of otherness, that's the source of unhappiness for Han. It's only by opening ourselves up and encountering otherness, that which resists and exceeds our own self, that real joy and transformation come. At the end of the day, both Russell and Han agree that unhappiness and often even depression results from self-absorption and a closed-in world. And so they both argue that happiness and fulfillment depends on our ability to turn outward towards the external world and to other people. To get over ourselves, we have to cultivate forms of engagement with the wider world. We have to expand the borders of our experience and step out into land that doesn't belong to us and is not familiar, like Don Quixote does when he decides to ride out into the burning plains of central Spain. Okay, now, since I'm on Russell here, I should briefly mention one more important thing that he talks about. Something that's related to this idea of engagement that I just mentioned. So he also devotes a chapter to what he calls living with zest. And basically, what he's saying is that while self-preoccupation contracts the world, zest, well, that expands it. Basically, what zest is for Russell is a passionate way of engaging with the world, one that's characterized largely by curiosity and openness. And it's this, along with this outwardness of attention, that brings real joy and happiness, Russell says. Zest is present when we can easily get absorbed in external tasks and when we can take interest in what other people consider boring. Basically, it's a mode of engagement or a disposition that transforms the mundane into something that we want to spend time with and that gives us great satisfaction. Actually, you know what? In his own way, Byung-Chul also talks about something like zest. Now, to be clear, he doesn't use that word. Instead, the word that he uses to describe the similar phenomenon is eros, which is the Greek word for desire or love. So eros for Han is our capacity to be attracted by something that transcends our own self. It's to be made alive by what lies beyond our egos. Now, this sort of spirit is being eroded today, Han thinks, especially living as we do on our devices. We no longer encounter true otherness, but only mirrors of ourselves. Everything is a self-referential circuit. And so we're not open to the world, and so we're not moved by it. And that is not love. And that is a recipe for unhappiness. So to conclude then, even though Russell and Han are operating in different historical contexts, they do offer a shared insight. And that is that happiness is not going to come about by constantly going inward or by one way or another being preoccupied with oneself. No, for them, happiness needs a movement beyond the self. It requires a redistribution of attention away from the self towards the world's objects and activities and people. At the end of the day, happiness isn't a feeling that we uncover inside of us. No, it's a way of being in contact and relating with everything wondrous that lies outside of us. Bye for now.